A very good afternoon to all. I hope I am audible. Okay, thank you for letting me know, Harmeet. Okay, thank you so much. Professor Anita, I hope we are connected.
Yeah, yeah, I'm very much here.
Thank you
I'm
very
very
much,
much
ma'am.
here. Yeah.
Very good afternoon to one and all. And I'm so sorry for the slight technical issues that cropped up. Couldn't help it. We were trying to set it out as much as possible. Thank you for your patience. And let me just first of all introduce Professor Anita Singh. Professor Anita Singh is a professor and head in the Department of English at Banaras Hindu University. She has received Fulbright Nehru Visiting Scholar Fellowship for the year 2013-14 at the University of Virginia in USA. She was a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla and from the year 2018 to 2020. Her recent publications include Staging Feminism, Gender, Violence, and Performance. She has also edited two volumes titled Gender, Space, and Resistance, Women and Theatre in India, Hero and Hero Worship, Fandom in Modern India. She is the president of the Asian African Association for Women, Gender, and Sexuality. I'm so grateful to Professor Anita Singh. I know that she had a very, very important engagement in the morning, and still, she is connecting with us today at this hour and bearing with the technical problem that we had. I'm so grateful to you, ma'am, and our students are all ears for you. They are keen to hear from you about Elan Chalter's feminist criticism in the wilderness. Over to you, Professor Neeta Singh.
Okay. So, so the audience are, are enrolled in your university. They are doing this open course.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, they are.
Okay.
They are
Okay. So, okay.
students of.
Okay. So I wonder how familiar are they with feminist criticism?
They have
So
already
is they have already done perfect.
been.
Then maybe this will add to what they have already done. Mm, I'm just trying to share my presentation if I can.
It's visible, ma'am. We
It's
can see that.
visible now? Perfect, perfect.
Yeah,
So
it's.
all of you can see my slide, right? It's visible?
It says it's. Yeah,
Huh?
it should be visible as you present.
I mean, the
Maybe
first slide is visible.
no, not yet.
Oh my God. Wait, wait, wait. I'll have to do it. Redo. Now is it visible?
Not yet, ma'am.
Oh, which means mm, I'll have to redo it.
No problem, ma'am.
Just a minute. Mm, I think I'll have to share screen. Let me see if this works.
Share screen and play the PPT.
I know, but that I wonder why is it not happening? Um, share entire screen. It says share entire screen. Now is it visible?
Yes, it
Huh?
is.
Okay,
Yes,
good,
yes,
good. Okay, perfect. It's visible still?
yes, ma'am.
Okay, then it's
We can
good.
see the title
Okay,
slide is
so because we are now delayed, so how much time do I have? Half an hour or I
visible. Same,
continue? Hmm?
ma'am. You have 1 hour with you.
Okay, okay, okay. So I thought because we have missed out on half an hour. So
No,
I
no.
can't see the audience, but I'm sure you are familiar with feminist criticism in the wilderness. So what I do is I'm trying to look at uh, feminism as a, so I'll put it very simply, feminism as a movement happened somewhere around very obviously in the 19th century. Okay. And it kind of coincided also with the freedom movement in most of the countries. So the demand for the feminist movement was equal rights, right to education, right to work, and so on and so forth. And also, there was a realization that women were misrepresented in literature, women were misrepresented in media, and in religion, in mythology, and so on. Okay, so I'm only taking one segment, that is misrepresentation of women in literature, or the absence of women in literature, or misogyny of women in literature, how women were treated in a stereotypical way, misrepresented, and so on. So there were many writers who were doing this, like they were looking at literary works, they were examining literary works, and they were looking at how women were misrepresented. So another strand of feminist criticism has two very important strand. Okay, so first strand is re-examining already existing canonical works. Okay, the already existing works that were written, established, had attained a certain kind of a reputation, were taught in colleges and universities, and so on, like works of Lawrence or Thomas Hardy and others. So, or I mean, if you go to religious texts like or epics and legends and all that, so these texts were also taken up for examination, for looking at the representation of women, or the absence of women, or the lack of voice that women had there. The second strand of feminist criticism was what is called gynocriticism. Gynocriticism means how women speak about themselves, how women speak about their experiences, how women are empowered to talk about themselves, and how women talk about themselves in their writing. So, as I said, that there were several works that were examining this. The first one you may be familiar with is A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. So, this is the first, probably, popular book that we can say that talked about rights of women, and also talked about women's education, and also said that very often women were represented as being fragile, feminine, and weak. So the importance of education is great on women's life, and that is how they can change the way the perception of the society. We are also familiar with Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, wherein again Simone de Beauvoir talks about how women are considered to be the weaker sex, the second sex, they are othered in so many different ways in society. And literature is also one of the aspect which we are taking up now. How literature marginalizes women, and later how literature becomes a tool for empowerment of women. Okay. Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. Virginia Woolf herself was a writer and the daughter of an important Victorian critic. So she writes that it is very important for women to have financial independence. It is very important for women to speak what they feel. So in A Room of One's Own, she talks about women's financial independence, women's education, and women's ability to speak out, and so on. Then we had another important work called by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gruber, and they said that 19th century women writers were not really considered to be women writers. So the common stereotype of women were they were homemakers, they can only look after children, they can be reproducers of children, and not producers of fictional narrative, or not writers, so to say. So here Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gruber, they do what? They analyze the psychology of the writer, and how these writers of the 19th century were also bogged down by this kind of a stereotype and prejudice and perception of the society. And one of the symptom of this was, she says, many of the female writers assume the pen name of men. Like, for instance, a writer like Mary Ann Evans, a very feminine name, very clearly a women's name. So she took up the pen name of George Eliot. So you can understand the pressure of a woman not to, publish a work in her name. Why? Because she would not be published in the first place. People will not read her work because it is coming from a writer, and people will not circulate it. It will be away from production, circulation, and consumption. People will not even consume such a work. So here she talks about the psychology of women writers. And similarly, the other writers also, like Showalter talks about British women novelists from Bronte to Doris Lessing. So she takes a historical context of these writers right from Bronte to Lessings. And then we have Alice Walker, who takes a very little different context, and she says, what happens when a black woman starts to write? She has no role models before her. So Alice Walker says that we need to unearth, we need to bring to the front the black women writers who have been writing, whose works have not been popular because they were the foremothers of the writing and so on. So this is a background to what feminist criticism or women who were writing and writing about women, a kind of a background of the other writers who were writing. Now, what are the intentions of feminist literary criticism? Why are they writing? First, they are writing to expand the tradition of writing, of female writing, of writing. The more diverse kind of experiences we have, the better the literature is. The more diverse voices we have, the better the literature is. So they are writing to expand the tradition of female writing, LGBT writing, and so on, because we believe that it enriches us, our experiences as human beings. So this was one first part, that they expand the tradition. Then interpreting the way women write and what are they writing about, giving women's writing a significant place, considering female writers from the women's perspective, and so on, and examining how stereotypes have been presented in canonical work and rediscovering the works of women. Now, as I said, Showalter in her work, uh, towards the feminist poetics, that's a different work. She says women's literature can be divided into three phases. So, primarily, she's looking at the history of women writing, and she says one was a feminine phase, second was a feminist phase, the third was a female phase. So, feminine phase, she says, is where women wrote about their weaknesses. They had internalized that the fact that they are weak and they are not able to write as well as the men do. The second was a kind of a revolutionary phase, a reactionary phase, that women wrote, protested against male standards and values and advocated a kind of a very different kind of a writing. The third is a female phase, that is a more phase that is more understanding, wherein women writers understood the fact that we cannot be separatist, we cannot be go to another extreme of being weak as writers, but we have to have an amalgamation of both, an imitation and protest. So the first phase was imitation, feminine was imitation. Second was very, if we very simply, if we can say, it was protest. And the third was more of a adaptation phase. You adapt the standards and you adapt the way you write. So this we have already done. What does feminist criticism aims at? Liberating intellectual act, to be a resisting reader, to read something and to, like, for instance, you go to watch a movie, so you look at it from the perspective, from a feminist perspective. So you see what is the portrayal of women, how are women, have women been given agency and voice, and so on. So feminist criticism also believes in a reader's response. How do you respond to a text? Different, it a feminist criticism offers different and alternative perspective and different significance from the same text. So for instance, again, if you look at Shakespeare's text, or for that matter Hamlet, so Hamlet could be understood from so many different perspectives, a psychological perspective or a feminist perspective, when you're looking at the role of Ophelia and how Ophelia has been treated in the text by her father, her brother, her lover, and so on and so forth. And what is the fate of Ophelia? And rediscovering a feminist subtext. So, what are the undercurrents in the writing of a woman? How are they silenced? What are the things that they have not written, and so on? So, Showalter begins her essay by talking about that feminist criticism does not have a methodology of its own. It does not have its own methodology. It is very plural, so it borrows extensively from the already existing methodologies. For instance, close reading of the text, reader response theory, deconstruction, psychological theories, and so on. So it is borrowing from all the existing theories in order to bring to the front the experiences of the women present in the writings. So it's a kind of, so Shorter says it's a kind of a wilderness. There's no clarity in what methodology that one has to follow. So on the one hand, Shorter says this could be a drawback, this could be a confusion, or this could be a demerit as far as feminist criticism is concerned. Or one could say that one could see it as a kind of a drawback or a fault in feminist criticism. But on the other hand, she says, no, it was actually a merit. It's actually an advantage to use different kinds of theoretical school and be strong. So Scholter says that it is good that they do not have a single methodology, and they have several tools to look at a certain perspective. Okay, so she says that feminist criticism, which is in wilderness, is actually good for the feminist critic because it enables them to use different tools and different ways to address those issues. So this I have already mentioned earlier, that there are two distinct modes of feminist criticism. One is women as reader and women as writer. So women as reader mean women who read and who critique the already existing canonical text. So this is also called feminist critique. Sholto also calls it a feminist critique, wherein the critique, the feminist critique looks at the omissions, misconceptions, stereotypes of the images that are projected in the text. How are women represented in the text? How are they? Why are they absent from the text? And so on. So all this enables them to re-examine the existing text and to see how how what is wrong in the canonical text and what are the misrepresentation of women that has made the socio-cultural condition of the women or strengthen the socio-cultural condition of the women. So very often we misrepresent somebody or we kind of stereotype somebody, and this stereotyping leads to a kind of a homogenization or a universalization. So for instance, a woman occupies a position of power, so you say, oh, how can she handle this? So why are we saying that even without examining or without looking at the capability of the women? Because we are going by our past experiences and we are homogenizing it, or we are universalizing the fact that a woman cannot be an effective writer or a speaker or a person who is in a dominant position. Now, next she says women as writers. So, women as readers, feminist critique, women as writer, gynocritique. So, these are the two terms that she has popularized in feminist criticism. So, when we look at literature, there are two ways, two lenses from which we can examine. One, as a critique to already existing work, canonical works or works by men or religious text or texts that have represented women in a particular light and so on. And second important, she says, is women as writer, gynocritics. Who are these women who are writers, writing? What are their style? What are their themes? What are the genres? What are the structures of the writing? And how do they talk about themselves? And so on. What are the vantage point from which they are writing? So there are many texts. I have mentioned some Ellen Moore's Literary Women, Showalter's Literature of Their Own, and so on. So they've all examined women as writers. And I already told you about Susan Gilbert and Susan Guber, who talk about mad women in the attic. And they say, who are these writers who are writing? What are the socio-cultural, political background that they come from? And how do they represent their experiences? And so on. So women writing essentially makes us, and then she says that, uh, when women write, they write in a particular way. And she says there is again a kind of a stereotype that women and men write differently. So is it true? So these are the questions that we are still examining. Do men and women speak differently? Do men and women have different bodies that make them very different? Do men and women have different minds that make them very different? Or what, wherein lies the difference? So next, so first, so the entire essay is in two parts. The first part is feminist literary criticism has two strands. One is feminist critique or women as readers. The second is women as writer or gynocritics. So either women are re-examining already existing literature, or women are examining the fact how women are writers, what enables them to write, and how they write, what is exhibited in their writing, what is so peculiar in their writing. So these are the things that Showalter says that a feminist literary criticism unravels or understands. Now she moves on to a different question. Now the question that she raises is, where lies the difference? So we very often ask the question, men and women write differently. So she says, do they write differently? And if it is an assumption or it is a presumption that men and women write differently, what is it that makes different in their writing? Is it biology, because they are biologically different? Is it because they are biologically different that they write differently? Is it because they speak differently that they write differently? Is it because their minds are different, they're psychologically different, that they write differently? Or finally, she asks the question, is it because of the culture that they write differently? So now she raises this question, and she will take up each issue, each of these four issues, and examine them, whether biology makes the difference in the writing, excuse me, or language makes a difference in the lighting, or their minds makes a difference in the lighting, or ultimately it's the culture that makes a difference in the writing. Okay, thank you. Sorry. So first issue that she takes up, women's writing and women's body. So she says, is it because women's bodies are different that they write differently? We know women's bodies are different. We are differently constituted, and uh, a lot of work has already been done that says that because women inhabit a certain kind of body, they are weaker and they are unable to do things that man can do, and so on. Then she says there are a lot of literary metaphors of maternity that dominated in 17th and 18th century, and we know static land is often compared to a woman's body, and men are compared to time, active principle, and so on. So there was Thackeray, Makepeace Thackeray was once writing a book, and his book was almost on the verge of completion. So some critic asked him that, is your book ready? So he said that I'm carrying it in the ninth. It is almost in the ninth month. I mean, so he uses the metaphor of pregnancy in order to describe how his work has been. Almost he's about to deliver his work, and so on. So these metaphors abounded, women as land, and as I said, that women were always equated with reproduction, and man was with production. Jane Austen also once very famously said that pen was in his hand. So he was a writer. He was, uh, capable of. It was commonly understood that man was capable of writing, man was capable of thinking, man was a rational being. So these are stereotypes that have been projected and propagated since time immemorial. And we understand now that these are stereotypes and they do not hold any ground. So Susan Sontag's work, Illness as Metaphor, also talks about how when women get disease, how they are shamed and silenced, and so on. So similarly, women are also discouraged, shamed, and silenced, and they are not told to be they think they are told that their bodily experiences are shameful and not something to be discussed in public. Rachel Blow Duplass in Washing the Blood says that we've always thought of, the bodily activities to be something that is shameful, something is to be hidden and not described. So the modern feminist writing or the modern writers talk about their bodily experiences, talk about the everyday experiences that they have had to reclaim their bodies. So the whole idea is to reclaim their body. So at the end, where Showalter talks about body and women and writing, and she says how women have been abandoned from their bodies and told to write beyond their bodies and not through their bodies. So now the slogan is that you must write your body into your work. So that is why she comes to the conclusion in this part that uh, women do not write differently because their bodies are different. They write because anatomy has nothing to do with it. And women write because these are the ways that women have been told that their bodies are dirty, because if they're menstruating, because if they are giving birth. So there are certain facts about women's body that was to be hidden and so on. So she comes to a conclusion that it is not in the body that the difference lies between man's writing and women's writing. So the next part she comes to women's language and women's writing. So does the difference between man's writing and women's writing lie in women's language, or does it lie in men's language? So women, that women speak differently. Now, what are the stereotype? Women speak a lot. We have all heard these stereotypes so very often. Women speak a lot. Women use a lot of adjectives when they speak. uh, Women use a lot of adjective when they speak. And women are very vague when they speak. They are not really uh, they're not very rational when they speak. So women have a different way of speaking, which is different from men. So this was a kind of a stereotype. Now increasingly we now understand that women speak differently. If they spoke differently, it is because of the spaces that they inhabited. They inhabited familial spaces, and in the familial spaces, words of affection, words of connection, words of these were the words that were more importantly used. And man inhabited the public space. Hence the language that the man used was rational. The language that the man used was more scientific and so on, more sure. He was more sure when he was, or more objective use of language. And women's language, because she inhabited the private sphere, so her language was more familial. So the theory that man and women speak differently, or women write differently because she speaks differently, was dismissed by Showalter, because she says men and women speak differently because they inhabit different social spaces. And because they inhabit social spaces, it enables them to speak in a language differently. If men and women inhabit the same social, political, cultural space, they will be speaking similarly and hence writing similarly also. There have been a lot of misconception that women have women, there was a women's language and it was abundant and so on. So she debunks everything, and she says that women have been banned. Again, women have been banished for language. So because women have not been occupying positions of power or positions of authority. For instance, we are all familiar with the word chairman. So there was a time that this chairman had a lot of currency. But because many women are now coming to positions of power or occupying positions of power, now what do we have? We have a gender neutral word, and we say chairperson, a policeman, again police person, police personnel, and so on. So we now what we are doing is we are making language more gender neutral to accommodate more and more women who are occupying the public spaces. So then, so women are in a prison house. Nietzsche says we are all in the prison house of language. Now women say we are in the prison house of man-made language. So now what the whole effort is to revise the man-made language and make it more accommodating and equitable, so that women's experiences, women's spaces are also accommodated similarly. So or other words, women have been colonized in the language by man's language, and now women need to decolonize themselves by bringing in what they call is a new speak. And then finally in this section she comes to a conclusion that, and she says it not to be in the language that we base a theory of difference. So the theory of difference was on four ways. One was that we have done body, and then she says no, body, women's body, the difference does not lie in women's body, difference does not lie in the women's language. And then she comes to women's writing and women's psyche. So very often, the significant psychoanalysts like Sigmund Freud had said that women are born with a kind of a lack. They lack something, and all their lives they feel this lack. They feel that they have been deprived. They feel that they are not as powerful as men. So Sigmund Freud literally talked about, and he said, anatomy is destiny. So if you are born with a particular anatomy, your destiny is also pre-decided. But another psychologist, Jacques Lacan, says that this is, symbolic. This is symbolic. These are metaphors, and not really. I mean, it's not about women that they lack something, but they can attain that power. So it's all about attaining that power. So there are several psychoanalysts who talk about how women's psyche has been framed. So first, Freud had said that women are destined to be the way they are. That is secondary, inferior, castrated, and so on. But the modern day psychologists are re-examining these concepts and re-examining the predestined destiny of women. So Nancy Kodorov's The Reproduction of Mothering, she says, in the first place, she critiques Freudian analysis. And she says, and she actually examines mother-child relationship. And she says that mother is the one who rears the child. Okay. So mother is the first caregiver of the child, or the first person whom the child comes in very close contact to. And this child sees the role of the mother as somebody who takes care of him or her, or somebody who's a provider, somebody who does everything. But in the larger context of the power politics in the house, the mother occupies an inferior position. All major decisions are made by the man. So the child grows to learn that the position of women is inferior. So the child is schooled into believing that the mother is inferior, because this is what the child has seen in his or her house. So Kodorov's idea is that if we have dual parenting, or if we have a parenting that is based on an equitable basis, where the mother and the father participate equally in rearing the child, a child will not grow up with a convoluted idea of the power dynamics in the house. So child will not grow up with the idea that man is superior to the woman, because woman does not take major decisions in the household. It is man who does. And this microcosm gets translated to the macrocosm of the world that he later on inhabits. So, to counter this, she says that if dual parenting is in place, then these problems will not arise. Karen Horney also talks about the needs of men and women. So she says if the needs of men and women are satisfied, then they grow up to be better human beings, and so on. And Melanie Klein talks about object relation theory, where she says that we as children are attached to certain objects, and we have a bond with certain objects. And if we grow up deprived of those objects that we value, then we grow up as disoriented individual. If we are fulfilled in the childhood, we grow up as fulfilled individuals, and so on. So all of these three psychologists that I just mentioned, they were all trying to say that how the psychology of a child is framed. And it is not always that a girl child, is born and grows up with a sense of lack. So how we rear our child, in what kind of an environment, enables the child to grow up as a full individual with full agency and autonomy. Lastly, Harold Bloom, he says that uh, men have their literary forefathers. They have their dual parenting, having an equitable parenting, having a parenting where our desires and wishes are fulfilled, and we have good role models before us, we grow up as strong individuals. And finally, the fourth one, on which she bases a model of difference. She says this is where the difference lies, not on language, not on body, not on psyche, but on culture. It is culture that makes us the way we are. It is culture that gives us a particular language. It is through culture that we frame our minds. It is a culture that makes our body similarly weak. Rosie Bradiato, in her work, talks about how bodies of women, which are considered to be weak, she says women also require a lot of training. With training you can make your body stronger, make your mind stronger, and so on. So if women's bodies are weak because they are not told to exercise, or not told to go out, or not told to have certain options, so this kind of weakens them and makes them fearful of the outside, or makes them fearful of the public spaces. So if we change the scenario, if we change the cultural context, then women can equally be strong as men. So she says a theory based on the model of women's culture can provide a more complete and satisfying way to talk about specificity and difference of women writing than theories based in biology, that is the body, linguistics, that is language, or psychoanalysis, that is the mind. So, three things that we have already discussed. She says herein does not lie the difference, because it is again further hinged on culture. Indeed, a theory of culture, she says, incorporates ideas about body, language, psyche, but interprets them in the context of social context in which they occur. So, the social context, the culture that we are born into, that we are raised, we are reared, they are very important in inculcating ideas and giving us and breaking stereotypes, or redoing the representation that we are faced with. A cultural theory acknowledges that there are important differences between women as writer, race, class, nationality, history, and they are all literary determiners as significant as gender. So now she says that it is culture that brings us into a certain kind of belief and so on. So she says there is a man's culture, there is a woman's culture. She follows the idea of Edwin Ardner, and she gives us a diagram. I mean, I have a diagram, I think, here. So we have this, you can say x and y. If y and x, so they kind of overlap. I think the diagram is slightly defective. It should overlap. And there's just small part where women's experience could be different. For instance, menstruating. For instance, giving birth to a child. So there are certain specific experiences which a man's experience could be different from a woman's experience, or a woman's experience different from a man's experience. But largely, if they are given the same cultural context, if they are given the same, kind of education, if they are given the same kind of a freedom to exercise their agency in political, economic, social fields, they will grow up as strong individual, almost as much as men are. And they may have certain experiences which she refers to as the wild zone, or the whiting, or the kind of the wild zone that she says, that could be different, but largely they are born out of the same kind of a context and so on. And okay, then she says that how should what cultural models, like how do we then explain a text, how do we then look at a text? Then she says the best way to look at a text is what Susan Guber and Gilbert call palimpsest. Palimpsest is when a woman writes, so she writes something, but there are certain things that she also wants to add. But because being a writer and because being a female writer, she is unable to write that. So they are what you call the hidden ink. Palimpsest is something that between what we, in common parlance, we say between the lines. So there are a lot of things that we need to understand between the text, between the lines of the text, we need to interpret. And another strategy or another methodology of reading a women's text, or any text for that matter, because all writers have certain specificities and they may not be out in the open. So they write something, but they have certain other tension or pull that they have. So, what are the methodologies of reading? Is reading between the lines of the text, what the writer says and what the writer intends to say, what is something that he or she has not said, that we as a reader can decode, we as a reader can unearth through the metaphors, images, and similes, or other ideas that the writer has projected. Another interpretive strategy or another methodology could be thick description. What Clifford Geertz, an anthropologist, uses the term thick description to understand a term. Like, for instance, if you're reading Shakespeare's, Taming of the Shrew, so you look into the context of how what was the position of the women, or using the co-text, using other socio-political documents in order to understand the position of the women and how are women described in that particular text, and what are the other characters' opinion about the women, and so on. So your description is not merely on the surface, but your description is more layered. It is a thick description. It is a more layered description. Actually, Geertz gives a very simple example of a to explain this the concept of thick description. He uses a very simple, as I said, a concept of wink. If there is somebody winks at you, okay, so very on the very first on the very surface, it could mean anything. I mean, if you look at it deeply, it could be the person who has winked at you wants you not to do certain thing. So it could be a warning, oh, don't do this. Or it could be in humor, it could be humor. It could be an affirmation, yeah, yeah, go ahead, do it. It could be an affirmation. So as I said, it could be humorous. So yeah, I mean, so this small wink could have so many meanings. It could be an affirmation, it could be a negative, it could be a humor. So similarly, so how did we decode this wink? By looking at the context, by looking at the speaker, the addresser addressee relationship, by looking at the context in which this physical movement of the eye was made, that is, the wink was made. So a wink is not a simple neutral behavior or physical movement of the eye, but it is related to the addresser addressee relationship. It is related to the larger context in which the addresser is making this movement to the addressee. So it's a very complex thing, that and we need to unearth the complexity of a certain situation when we are reading a text. So we need to look at all the characters, the situation, in order to understand the beauty of the text, or understand the meaning of the text. Okay, I think so. With this, I have finished. So I moved a little quickly. So if you have questions, we can take that. If you have
Thank you.
questions now,
Thank you.
yeah, we
Thank
can.
you, Professor
Yeah,
Ratan Singh.
yeah.
A very well comprehensive
Mhm.
explanation, and all that was required. I think this
Mhm.
is like a reinforcing kind of a lecture, whereby the students who have already read this
Read
or
this, right,
attentive
right.
during the lecture
Mhm.
already, I mean, no, I mean, ma'am has touched so many things. And so, ma'am, the psychological things, the works of Nancy, Karen,
Uh-huh.
Melanie, and
Mhm.
others, pertaining the psychological part, I think is very, very important for everyone to
Yes,
understand why this pluralism, and why Elan Scholter is talking about a wilderness. And
yes.
definitely, women have to find a way themselves, when we talk about this. So, ma'am, thank you so very much
Thank you. Thank you.
for sparing your
Yes.
valuable time and expanding on Elon Scholter's feminist criticism in the wilderness. Students, quickly, could we have a few questions from you?
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Very nice lecture.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So nobody has any question? It's good that you have done this before. So that makes it easier for me. So they don't seem to have questions.
Yeah. Ma'am,
Okay.
ma'am, could I please request you to stop sharing
Yeah.
so that we can have
Okay, okay.
our videos on and we can just
Yes.
click a
yes,
picture.
yes. Okay.
And meanwhile, if some question dawns on any of the learners, they can just immediately.
You can ask others to switch on the videos.
Yeah, please,
Uh,
dear students, kindly switch on your videos so that we can have one
Uh.
picture with ma'am. Sometime, ma'am, you were supposed to be in Patiala. It's been long due. So many years. I think
yeah,
2
yeah,
years now.
definitely. I
Yeah.
really want to come to Patiala. I really
Yeah.
really want to.
We
So
would love
next
to
time it will
host
be,
you
be
for
an
an offline session.
thing. Yes.
Yes.
Next time it will be offline.
Yes, sure, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Bye
Thank
bye
you.
all. Thank you. Bye bye.
Okay.
Bye bye.